Disclaimer. These builds will be far from meta. I do not recommend bringing any of these builds into a group setting without permission from the group leader. Hello everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Can It Work? Today we are covering Flash Flood, a Magicka-based sorcerer. The direction I wanted to take with this build was to make a true shock mage, with as exclusive an emphasis on shock damage as possible. As a bonus, I also wanted to make use of one of the elemental sets, in this case Netch's Touch, just because it's something I rarely see in other build guides and it seemed cool. Now in all honesty, the character kind of creates itself once you apply those restrictions. For shock damage, there are really only two sources, the Sorcerer's Stormcalling line and the Destruction Staff weapon line. That right there gives me all the skills I'll use, and combined with Netch's Touch, that's more than half the build already. After some initial testing, I settled on the following morphs and additional sets. From Stormcalling, I chose Energy Overload for sustain, Endless Fury also for sustain, Boundless Storm simply because shock damage instead of physical, Lightning Flood for raw damage, Crit Surge because this is not a healer build, and Streak. From the Destruction Staff, I chose Elemental Rage, Crushing Shock for the interrupt, and because we have plenty of AoE already, Unstable Wall because the timer lines up with Lightning Flood, Destructive Reach, Elemental Drain for sustain, and Elemental Ring. For sets, I opted to go with the basic 5-5-2 setup with all light armor. So in addition to Netch's Touch, I also chose Treasure Hunter and Stormfist. Now, both of these sets are a bit meh for me personally, and are not my first picks for this build, but I simply didn't have another choice in my situation. Instead of Stormfist, I would much rather use Archdruid Deviric's set because who doesn't want easy access to shock damage and a major vulnerability? But I do not own the Lost Depths, so yeah. As for Treasure Hunter, I would like to use Thundercall instead, but I also don't own Waking Flame. But also, this build lacks any form of burst heal. Because of this, I opt to use health potions, so I can't use my potions to upkeep Major Prophecy. And it is essential that Major Prophecy is kept up, as our only heal with this build is Crit Surge, and we have to do our best to get that maximum 1 tick per second to sustain us through most damage. That said, if you are playing in a group and feel comfortable that your healer will keep you up, you can definitely use the normal spell power potions and wear Thundercaller instead. It'll be much better, not just statistically, but RP-wise as well. For CP, I made sure to use Biting Aura and Thaumaturge, as the majority of our skills are AoEs and dots. Outside of that though, feel free to choose what you want here. I personally wanted to try and max out spell damage, though as I'll mention later, that might not be the best option. Overall, I was impressed at how well this build performed out of the gate. Minus some particular areas, the Stormcalling and Destruction Staff skill lines complement each other quite well and provide good flexibility while also having a very identifiable core focus. AoEs are of course the name of the game for this build, and you should always be trying to get at least 2 targets together whenever possible. Crit Surge and Boundless Storm are your 2 must-maintain abilities. Letting either of these drop will significantly reduce your survivability, but you also lose major sorcery with Crit Surge. The timers on these 2 skills is close enough together that you can always cast them as a pair. This will prevent Surge from dropping off as you will lose Boundless Storm first, which is a very noticeable visual effect on your screen. Below this, Lightning Flood and Unstable Wall are your next priority skills, especially in AoE fights. Both provide a lot of pure damage, which is great, but they also tick fast enough to proc Surge consistently. Additionally, Unstable Wall can put targets off balance if they are afflicted with concussion, which with the amount of shock damage that this build puts out is pretty much all the time. During AoE fights, this isn't as important, but in single target fights, the extra sustain from off balance is incredibly helpful. Now, speaking of single target fights, that's where Destructive Reach and Elemental Drain come in. Drain should be applied to pretty much any target that is tier 2 or higher, as the Major Breach becomes a real difference maker at that point, and the additional sustain is nice too. Destructive Reach can be used similarly, though its effect is less noticeable on things smaller than bosses or bigger trial mobs. Crushing Shock is spammable in single target fights, though it is also very useful for interrupting ranged targets. It is worth noting though that at even 2 targets, Elemental Ring actually does more damage per cast with all of our buffs to AoE damage, as well as its own buff that makes it do more damage for every target it hits. In trash fights especially, Ring becomes spammable, as its cost becomes easy to sustain with the help of Endless Fury. On top of being our execute, Fury also has the wonderful effect of regenerating nearly 5,000 Magicka every time you kill an enemy with it. In a perfect scenario, this pairs great with the Destruction Staff if you can manage to get the enemy just low enough with Fury to finish them off with any other staff damage within the 5-second window of Fury. Not only will you get the 4.8k back from Fury, you'll get an additional 3.6k from the Destruction passive Ancient Knowledge. So that's over 8,000 Magicka back on a single kill if you can execute it right. but even if you mess it up, either on its own is plenty for recovering after spamming ring and trash fights. Finally, we have Streak, which is mostly used for mobility. This skill is great if you need to get around the battlefield faster or to get out of a sticky situation. Beyond that though, it also has the stun where you land, which can make this skill equally useful for engaging targets. If you're starting a fight with targets who are already grouped, you can simply use Streak to warp in and stun them, giving you time to drop your flood and wall and get a few ring blasts in. Alternatively, against spread groups, you can engage from mid-range by debuffing the heaviest target, then when the melee enemies get close, you streak over to a ranged target and start dropping AoEs there. This will not only ensure that you get at least one extra ranged target in your AoEs, but will also both effectively kite the melee targets while disabling a potentially high priority target. I must say, getting familiar with this skill is one of the most unique and fun elements of this build. I only wish it went the way you were moving rather than the way you were facing. For ultimates, it's quite simple. Elemental Rage is great for AoE fights, Energy Overload for single target. Energy Overload is especially helpful as you can either maintain Magicka while weaving with light attacks, or minimize the damage loss from heavy attacking to restore resources. Just be mindful of heavy attacking with Overload while the enemy is off balance. It will not restore extra resources like a normal heavy attack. The results from this experiment I would say were quite pleasing. As a player of fairly poor skill, I was able to solo several world bosses and base game vet dungeons, as well as complete a veteran Maelstrom arena. In a parse, again with my skills, I was able to average around 19k DPS on the basic dummy. Obviously, by today's standards this is really bad, but at least this build can technically fulfill its intended role and pass DPS checks. So if the question is, can it work? For this build, the answer is a yes. Now, some things to note for those who may try this build. Critical rating is a major necessity. Having reliable healing from crit surge is essential to staying alive, especially in solo content, so ensuring that you're hitting enough crits is important. Unfortunately, we cannot capitalize on this with higher crit damage in most cases, as we don't use medium armor or anything to grant force. This build can also struggle with sustain in single target fights, so pushing spell damage the way I did through CP and enchantments is likely not the best course of action. That said, with a race like Breton and/or some sustained food, you can push the boundaries a bit more. If you play with friends, this build would pair great with a single target oriented partner like a Nightblade, or someone who can help stack mobs like a Dragon Knight or a Warden. And that concludes the experiment for the Flash Flood build. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Peace.